Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, college football edition, week 7, at least that's what I counted to on my fingers. A great show in store for you today. A massive tilt in the Pac-12, a couple of other intriguing matchups that'll help the national championship landscape continue to take shape. I am your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my esteemed colleagues and co-hosts, Brad Powers and Payne Insider. And gentlemen, how goes it this fine Wednesday morning?
Doing well. Excited about this week's slate of games.
No complaints. Glad you are not a poor carpenter.
I'm not even sure where to take that or what to say.
Said you're counting on your fingers.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, look,
Jeez.
I have all my fingers. I have all my
Bad
I have
jokes
all
to
my
start
fingers.
the
I
morning.
have all my digits. I mean, these hands weren't built for manual labor. Let's not sugarcoat it. As if the two of you over there are going to build a house. I make Brad a massive favorite to be able to do that more so than you, Payne.
Oh, my God. There's no question. No question.
Yeah,
Best
well,
bet of
I
the
mean,
week.
that's an easy winner. If you got a guy to call for something, you're calling that guy. But all right, boys, we got a lot of football to cover here with 5 marquee matchups, and we'll take you off the grid as we do every week with a non-Powers 5 game right around the halftime portion of the program. But going in rotation order, the first order of business will be what's going to unfold at Neyland Stadium on Saturday afternoon when Tennessee, fresh off a bye, welcomes in a Texas A&M team who let a glorious opportunity for a season-defining win slip through their fingers last week against the Alabama Crimson Tide. And it's Tennessee, slightly more than a field goal favorite in this game. Total in the contest, 55.5. And when we look at Texas A&M, they've now lost 7 straight road games. It's the school's longest streak since 8 straight from 2002 to 2004. Meanwhile, the Vols are starting to regain a little bit of that legacy and lore playing at home. They've won 12 straight home games, the school's longest streak since they accomplished 23 straight from 1996 back to 2000. When we dissect both sides of the ball, I think there are a lot of questions in a game like this that have to be answered. And Brad, Texas A&M offensively had been billed coming into the year that this offense was going to look drastically different than what we'd seen in the past. Bobby Petrino was going to get the most out of quarterbacks. Clearly, Aggieland thought that Connor Wegman would be that guy. He gets hurt, lost for the season. In steps Mac Johnson. But it doesn't matter who played quarterback. It could be Johnny Manziel under center, Brad. This A&M offensive line can't protect anybody, but is Tennessee the kind of team that's able to put pressure on them and slow down some of those difference makers that A&M has operating in space, like an Aeneas Smith or an Evan Stewart?
I think so, because I would argue that, Tennessee's one of their major strengths has been getting to the quarterback. There's been some inconsistencies in a few of their games, and I'm not sure we got a bunch of great data points to see how great this Tennessee defense is. I mean, you're certainly concerned that Florida was able to run on them in that game, but I got to be honest, I've been a little bit more pleased with Tennessee's defense this year. They've done better than expected. Rewatched the South Carolina game. South Carolina hit them with one explosive, but other than that, I like the push that the Tennessee defensive front got. Albeit against a struggling South Carolina offensive line, but we have a struggling Texas A&M similar offensive line here. James Pierce is a guy that's flashed to me since the opener against Virginia. Pro Football Focus has his team with the number 5 pass rush in the country. So I do expect a team that's already gotten to the quarterback 22 times already this year to have success against an A&M offense that, yeah, the counting stats say they're improved, and how could they not be after last year's abysmal failure? They looked better, and I know the competition was weaker, but they looked more explosive and better the first 3 games under Wegman than certainly the last 3 games. And if you don't believe me, let's just take a look at it. I mean, Max Johnson's QBR is significantly worse than Wegman. The yards per attempt are less. Completion percentage significantly less. We're talking 8% less. He's taken more sacks, 8 in the last 3 games compared to 3 for Wegman. The wide receivers aren't popping as much outside of Ainias Smith. I mean, Evan Stewart, I know he's a little bit banged up in last week's game, but he hasn't flashed to me like he did early in the season. They don't really, Texas A&M doesn't have a game-changing go-to back. Le'Veon Moss has gotten a majority of the carries the past 2 weeks. And you thought that maybe they were turning the corner a little bit as far as the run game against Auburn and Arkansas when you have back-to-back 200-yard games, but then Alabama absolutely shut them down last week. 67 yards, less than 2 yards per carry. Offensive line, you mentioned, it gave up 5 sacks. And you look at the 2 data points where they lost, Miami and Alabama. I mean, A&M hasn't been able to run the football. The early down stuff hasn't been great. The EPA is number 88 in early downs. Pass blocking hasn't been great. So if I had to go one way in this matchup with the A&M offense against the Tennessee defense, I'm giving the slight edge to the Tennessee defense.
You mentioned it. We've seen A&M go significantly more run-heavy to try and mask some of those protection issues. You look at the Aggies' O-line overall this year. They've allowed 101 pressures, the 4th most in the FBS. And when you don't have a mobile quarterback to extend plays, it puts you between a rock and a hard place. You talked a little bit about that Vols defense, and I think they've answered the bell. One question, though, that I have for you, Brad, on the Vols before we switch to the other side of things with Payne. Do you think Tennessee's secondary has drastically improved? I know the numbers from a pass defense standpoint look better, or do you think we attribute it more to how disruptive the defensive line has been, knowing that they're getting in the backfield, they're able to cause some of those havoc? You look at the sack numbers, tackles for loss, and all of those other key metrics. Do we think they're better in the defensive backfield, or is it more because of the push they're getting up front?
I'm not sure yet. Again, not a lot of great data points. I mean, the best team they played so far, Florida, doesn't wow me at the wide receiver position, so I'm not sure they've gotten fully exposed yet. Safety's been playing a little bit better than expectation. The Haddon kid that had a big pick 6 against South Carolina, I hated his effort in a couple plays against Florida, so been a little bit of a mixed bag. We're going to find out a hell of a lot more on Saturday.
There is no doubt it'll be an electric atmosphere there for Tennessee to try and hold serve a little bit more well-rested as they continue their quest for SEC East relevance, knowing that Georgia looked the part of a true frontrunner with their dominant performance last week against Kentucky. But Payne, if Tennessee's going to be able to make some noise, it's going to be because their offense starts to figure things out. And right now they lead the SEC in rushing, averaging more than 230 yards per game on the ground, but their offense has lacked some of that big play potential. They haven't been nearly as dynamic with Joe Milton at the helm as they were last year with Hendon Hooker. We had questions about the receiver room coming in, and that position doesn't get any better when Brew McCoy is lost for the season. They dominated the line of scrimmage in a win over South Carolina, running for 238 yards and 3 touchdowns, but they're still yet to put a 300-yard passing game on the books. And when we watch the Aggies, we saw it weeks ago with Tyler Van Dyke picking apart that secondary. You saw it to some extent with Jalen Milroe, albeit a low-volume passing day, but was able to hit some big shots. I think Jermaine Burton is still running against that Crimson secondary. When we try and break down Tennessee's advantages offensively, are they going to be stubborn and look to establish the ground game against the strength of DJ Durkin's defense, which is the run D, or is this the game where we finally see that Vols passing attack break out of its shell?
Has a lot to do with the game plan, and I think it's more so A&M's game plan. I was a little surprised by what Durkin did last week. I would say it was a suspect effort there schematically. I mean, I understand the limitations he's dealing with in the secondary, but you think about what you mentioned with Jalen Milroe, you just kind of repeatedly allowed him to make the throws he was most comfortable making over and over again, and it was everything that we talked about multiple weeks in advance, right? The ABC 1, 2, 3 paint by number throws that we pounded the table for Tommy Rees to design for Jalen Milroe, whether it was the quick short throws or the deep shot, right? You wanted Tommy Rees and Milroe to kind of decrease the intermediate throws, and DJ Durkin really didn't do anything to prevent that. And so A&M would either play soft coverage against Alabama and then send blitz behind it. And if you look, like A&M blitzed Jalen Milroe on 64% of his dropbacks last week. So it would basically allow Milroe to get the ball out quick. And then when the blitz didn't get home or Durkin changed the look and played tighter coverage, Milroe just took the deep shot. And that was the best throw in his arsenal. And so sure enough, you look, Milroe would just absolutely make A&M pay all game, right? 25% of his throws had an ADOT of 34 yards. He had a 156 rating on those deep throws. 0% turnover-worthy play rate, 75% adjusted accuracy on those deep throws. And I kind of reference that because I see Tennessee's offense, and they like to employ the quick short throw. And then they like to employ the deep shot. And so to me, like, you look, Milton's only attempted 16% of his passes in that intermediate area. The other 84% are either short or 20-plus yard throws. So it kind of like, I just don't know what Durkin's going to do. I'm not very fond of him. But if you look, like if Durkin has his corners play off coverage, all of a sudden, like, the quick short stuff is going to be there for Milton. And you see all those bubble screens for Tennessee. And then if Durkin elects to blitz and the Vols do a pretty good job picking that up, then there's going to be the deep shots there. And you also like the idea of Cade Mays being back this week to kind of help Milton, right? When those blitzes are coming, identify them. Where are they coming from? But I think the question mark becomes what you actually said at the top, because I'm still concerned about Joe Milton and the receiver play. Can you actually take advantage of those areas where A&M is susceptible? Because, they've been relatively good when punching down in class. They only really exceed expectation against South Carolina because of that run game you mentioned in the defense. We really haven't seen the combination of Joe Milton and his receivers play to a level that most expected this season. And for us, those were the two huge questions, right? Quarterback play and receiver quality. And, I think we all understand that Joe Milton can just throw it a country mile. The arm talent is enormous. It's the only reason he keeps getting opportunities to start at a P5 level and have scouts gawking over him. But you look through 5 data points, Milton's QB 123 out of 149 qualifiers in deep passing, 109th in turnover-worthy play rate on deep passes, 109th in adjusted accuracy on deep passes. This kind of has to be the game where the Vols hit those explosives, because, A&M's outside the top 100 in EPA per pass allowed. You mentioned Brew McCoy being out for the season at the top there, Todd. Only Squirrel White is playing above replacement level from the entire Vols receiver group. Jalen Wright and Dylan Sampson have been the best Vols pass catchers by grade this season. Word is Sampson could help Tennessee's receiver group this week. They may flex him out a little bit. But on paper, that's the area Tennessee needs to convincingly win to cover this game. Maybe the run game exceeds expectation for Tennessee. You look at A&M's defensive front, it's great. But occasionally, the young talent isn't always gap sound and they give up an explosive run or two. And we're kind of getting to that part of the season where fatigue can set in. A&M just played a physical game against Alabama. Now they travel to a hostile environment against a Vols offense fresh off a bye that operates at this breakneck pace, the fastest in the country. If the Vols run game gets going, they might not have to be as dynamic in the throw game. It might not be as obvious as Tennessee just needing to throw it to survive here. But certainly when you are looking at this game in advance, you're saying, hey, we got to be able to attack this A&M secondary. I just don't know if Milton can consistently do it and those receivers are good enough.
Yeah, a fascinating game, because for as much as we think we know about these teams, obviously still a lot to prove. And I think all things being equal, to your point, Payne, if A&M came in well rested, this handicap changes considerably, knowing that they have a little bit of time to prepare, to get themselves accustomed and acclimated to the pace that they're going to see from Tennessee, which is diametrically opposed to Alabama, who just wants to hit you in the mouth over and over and over again. So it's completely switching gears. Final thing on this game, Brad, I want to go back to where you had these teams rated before the season started and what kind of changes you may have made given the data points that we have for both.
Yeah, slight downgrades for both. I think Payne mentioned it. Joe Milton, we thought there'd be some consistency issues. There's been some bigger ones than even I expected. So slight downgrade on Tennessee, slight downgrade on A&M. I think they've overachieved up front. They have certainly lived up to that billing, maybe even faster than I expected up front on the defensive line. But obviously with Wegman out and now with 2 losses, downgrade for A&M as well. But still 2 teams in the top 25 firmly in my power
Makes
ratings.
a ton of sense. And I think East meets West. We had questions about both of these divisions and how they'll all unfold. Some of them will get answered Saturday afternoon at Neyland Stadium. From the SEC, boys, we'll go to ACC country, where it's the Miami Hurricanes going on the road to take on North Carolina. And UNC, we'll call pretty much a 4-point favorite, although there is plenty of 3.5 throughout the market. Total 57 largely painted across the board. And I know both of you have your medical degree from a variety of top-tier educational institutions. So this is the game where you get to play amateur psychologist and figure out what the fuck Miami was doing in the closing seconds of that game against Georgia Tech, not just electing to run the football, but where the defensive backs were not once but twice on deep balls from Haynes King. And Mario Cristobal at Monday's news conference comes out and said, I made the wrong call. Well, no shit. I take full ownership in not taking a knee and giving them the opportunity to have a couple extra plays and preventing us from sealing the win. Miami is not lined up in victory formation in any of its 5 games this season, opting instead to hand the ball off. But this is obviously the first time Miami was involved in a one-score game, and it was deja vu all over again, especially for Oregon fans who lived through that fateful night when Stanford took on the Ducks. Mario, at least, has been somewhat optimistic about the way Miami has responded in practice. We're not going to know that until helmets start colliding on Saturday and we see these teams out there with live bullets flying. When we go into these teams, North Carolina comes in 5-0 for the first time since 1997, the final season of Max Brown's first UNC tenure. They've beaten the Canes 4 straight, but 3 of those wins have come by exactly 3 points. North Carolina, 5 straight games scoring 31-plus points, one shy of matching a program record. Meanwhile, the Hurricanes, we mentioned their mental makeup to figure out exactly what they're going to be. The Canes are now 0-5 in ACC home games under Mario Cristobal, and they committed a season-high 3 turnovers last game, 5 turnovers after committing 3 through just the first 4 games. And the Canes remain one of the worst bets under Mario's leadership, 5-12 against the spread. Brad, when we look at Miami's offense, Tyler Van Dyke had seen his numbers to win the Heisman Trophy shoot up. 200-1 during the offseason, down as low as 75, was getting into the low 20s. But Tyler Van Dyke, fresh out of a bye, made some head-scratching throws, to say the least, last week against the Rambling Wreck. In steps a UNC defense that's drastically improved, but at the same time, the only balanced attack that North Carolina has faced all year was Appalachian State, and they struggled quite a bit. When you look at these 2 units going head-to-head, who do you give the edge to on Saturday?
Certainly, for me, it's still Miami, even off the loss. The basic counting stats say this is a much improved team. I mean, yards per play, top 10, yards per game, top 10, points per game, still in the top 15. Certainly improved over last year, but I will caution, I would argue that 3 of the 5 data points are pretty suspect competition, so we're going to learn a lot more about both units in this particular game. You mentioned Tyler Van Dyke. I mean, for the full season, the QBR looks good, but my goodness, last week, I mean, you can have any quarterback can have a breakdown with multiple interceptions. Maybe they got pressure in their face. Maybe there were some tip passes, but these were not of those variety. These were horrific decisions. I mean, throwing into multiple coverage in the end zone, throwing an out pattern where he got baited on nearly a pick 6. I mean, they were pretty bad. He looked more like last year's Tyler Van Dyke than what we saw earlier this year and going back 2 years ago. Restrepo's there, and certainly he's been a major reason why the Miami's pass attack has been much improved at wide receiver. Graded out as one of the top wide receivers, PFF. That's what the film looks like to me as well. Jacoby George and Colby Young have given them some big play threats, particularly in that A&M game. Parrish and Chaney have been okay at running back. They've been splitting the running back carries. Just film for me, Parrish. Not as highly regarded as Chaney, but I've liked what I've seen from him a little bit more on a running back. The thing that concerned me, among many things last week, obviously, final minute aside, I didn't think the offensive line got that much push last week. I mean, only at 3.5 yards per carry. I know Georgia Tech has a couple of guys up front that are good size and whatnot, but you'd expect a little bit more, especially coming off a bye. Didn't get much. As good as the pass game was against A&M, run game wasn't there, less than 100 yards in that one. So I'm interested to see what this Miami offensive line looks like. I mean, they looked awesome, but they're not playing Miami of Ohio, Bethune-Cookman, and Temple this week. And onto the other side, certainly the North Carolina defense has been much improved. I mean, the basic counting stats say they're a top 40 unit. I'm not there yet as far as, thinking this is an above average defense. Like you mentioned, Todd, maybe you look at the schedule and you see 4 Power 5 opponents and at least a name brand group of 5 team. But my goodness, South Carolina's offensive line was a mess in that opener. Minnesota, Pitt, Syracuse aren't going to wow me with great offenses. I mean, Minnesota and Pittsburgh have been terrible on offense. I could argue that App State might have been the best offense they've faced so far. And you look at that game, almost 500 yards they allowed. They over 200 yards rushing. And this North Carolina defense has struggled on early downs. They don't have a great defensive rush success rate. They got some bits and pieces, but you should when your sophomore, junior, and senior classes were all ranked in the top 15 as far as the consensus recruiting ranking. You should have some dudes on defense. I mean, Cedric Gray and Power Eccles, back-to-back years that they've led the way. They mentioned, going back to the spring, that Rucker kid was going to be their best pass rusher. He has been the case there. Another thing that I caught in the spring, that I'm not a big Gene Chizik fan, but he said something that impressed me and should carry over not only for his philosophy moving forward, but maybe some other power programs. But he was talking about the transfer portal and wanting high-level, the preference being wanting high-level FCS All-American types because they're talented, they prove it on the field, but they still have that hunger to prove it at a different level. And I guess what I'm getting at is they found a guy this year from the FCS that's really led the way on the back end. That Hussey kid from East Tennessee State certainly lived up to that billing. So no question about it. I don't know how you can't say that this North Carolina defense is improved this year. I just think that by far this is going to be the most talented offense that they face. So we're going to see how much improved they really are on Saturday.
There is no doubt, to your point, Tyler Van Dyke has to be better. Miami has playmakers, but a question if the hangover lingers from what got away from them last week and North Carolina can take advantage. Because obviously when you look at the Tar Heels on the other side of the ball, Payne, this is where their strength is. It's led by an NFL quarterback that may be the first quarterback off the board in Drake May. UNC had 644 yards of offense, 33 first downs, and held the ball for more than 37 minutes, all season highs in their 40-7 win against Syracuse. They're averaging right around 175 rushing yards per game, puts them in the middle of the pack in the ACC. But you look at Drake May, and he's saying the right things as well for a guy that's going to be playing on Sundays, that he's not necessarily hunting the deep ball. Other coaches, his coaches, have said that his game management is significantly better, and it's a far cry from the quarterback that we saw really struggle late last year with turnovers. Some of that obviously gets attributed to the offensive line. We can talk about North Carolina's ground game improving, but half of Mario Hampton's total rushing output this year came in one game against Appalachian State, and this Miami defense, at least on the surface, has been good against the run. This will be a different step up in class for them. But North Carolina finally had a chance to free Tez Walker, 6 catches for 43 in his team debut, take some of the pressure off other receivers out there, as Nate McCollum has kind of been the alpha with 27 receptions over the last 3 games. North Carolina offensively against the Miami defense. Miami looks the part as far as their counting stats are concerned, but Brad raised an excellent point. Who has Miami really played? There is no doubt that North Carolina will be the highest flying offense that the Canes have faced all season.
Both of you hit it perfectly. This is a step up in class for both sides. Easily the best quarterback and throw game Miami's faced all season. Easily the best defensive front Drake May and Carolina's played to date. And for me, it's pretty obvious this has to be a Drake May game. And you kind of are getting to where I wanted to go, and it was this emphasis that North Carolina has on being balanced this season. And it sounds nice, but as a result, the ball's been in Drake May's hands far less. And I understand North Carolina's offensive line got healthier last week with Lampkin back. But I look at the 2 better defensive fronts North Carolina's played, Minnesota and Pittsburgh. UNC wasn't overly efficient on the ground in either of those games. 32% rushing success rate against Pitt, only half a yard gain before first contact versus Minnesota. Miami's front 7 and safety play is elite. It's the reason they've only allowed 28% of runs to grade successful this season. Miami's top 10 in the country in both success rate and EPA per rush allowed, number 1 in defensive line yards allowed. So, for me, you think about going back to the preseason, the area of concern for Miami's defense was its corners. And the key here is North Carolina just cannot waste 7, 10%, 14%, 18% of its offensive snaps or whatever the number is, doing the less efficient thing and taking the ball out of Drake May's hands. And that's really been the least efficient part of North Carolina's offense. You look on early downs, they're just not bypassing enough third downs on early downs because they're trying to get this ground game going. And, I think that's... I look at Miami, right, and the counting stats look great. But you've kind of seen glimpses of issues against inferior opponents, right? We just saw the 75 yards of horrific corner play given up late last week, right? It's not just the fumble, or was it a fumble, not a fumble, like ACC officials, right? We kind of been telling you that before it actually became popular this year. But like when you adjust for schedule properly, like Miami's pass defense still outside the top 30 for us. They're not playing Miami, Ohio in weather, or Bethune-Cookman, or Temple in weather, or one of the worst Power 5 offensive lines in pass protection, or a transfer quarterback whose best attributes are his legs, right? Miami is getting arguably the best quarterback in the country here. And you mentioned the return of Tez Walker, Todd, there. Got his feet wet. It's his presence, right? He just created so much room for the other guys. And so you look at McCollum and Nesbitt last week. They combined for their most yards per route run this season in the game. Tez Walker and his elite deep speed returns. So it's just more room for Drake May to operate underneath. As you mentioned, that's kind of been the maturation in his game. Late last year, teams were kind of giving him the Mahomes treatment, making him go 10, 12, 14 play drives to score and kind of getting rid of that explosive element. He can do that now. The key here is, you look at Drake May, he's been getting the ball out quickly last week against Syracuse. That was a little bit of a change for him. If you look on average, he's releasing in about 2.8 seconds this season. That's 88th out of 134 qualifying quarterbacks. So it's not overly fast. And where I'm going with this is, like, if North Carolina is wasting early downs handing it off, it's going to be much tougher to dominate Miami through the air if they're able to pin their ears back on 3rd and medium plus, because I'm still not completely sold on North Carolina's ability to pass protect. The O-line is certainly experienced, just not a ton of elite talent up there. And Drake May has been pressured on 32% of his dropbacks this season against a very lackluster schedule of pressure fronts. Certainly Pittsburgh presents a little bit of a test there, but there weren't enough opportunities for Pittsburgh's defensive line to kind of pin their ears back and get after the quarterback. So the key here is like not wasting those early downs on running plays and then allowing Miami to kind of pin their ears back on some of those 3rd and longs, 3rd and mediums. This has to be a Drake May game, and I think if it is, they're going to find success through the air here with that receiver group very, very much intact. The group we thought coming into the season was going to be a
little night
strength.
game in Chapel Hill. We'll see which team can go out there and make big plays. No doubt Miami wants to erase lasting images of what could have been had they held on as a 3-touchdown favorite against Georgia Tech. Meanwhile, North Carolina looks to move to 6-0 and get one step closer to ACC chaos, where 3 teams could go 12-0 during the regular season, and we'll let the conference all sort out what it deserves. You can follow our esteemed handicappers and co-hosts on social media. You can follow Brad on X at BradPower7. You can follow Payne there as well at Payne Insider, and I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there. Also follow the podcast at BetTheBoardPod. All right, Payne, you get to take your bathroom break. You get to grab your beverage of choice, because we're leaning on Brad's expertise of all things non-Powers 5. And last week he took us to Logan, Utah, got us a winner over the total despite major market disagreement. Brad said, fuck that, we're getting you to the window either way, with Colorado State and Utah State going over the posted total. But Brad,
That's 3 curse words.
Yeah, I'm a little fired up. I slept about 3 hours last night.
28 minutes in. Yeah, well, you're out
I wouldn't say
gallivanting.
gallivanting. trying to dig. No cocktails on a school night or anything along those lines. From the Mountain West, though, to the MAC, Brad, and it's Bowling Green looking to try and bounce back from an anemic offensive performance last week against Miami of Ohio. They were whitewashed 27-0 the week after upsetting Georgia Tech as more than a 3-touchdown underdog on the road in Atlanta. But Bowling Green and uneven performances has probably been the best way to describe them. In 3 of the last 4 games, they've scored 7 points or less, but in steps a Buffalo team who hasn't exactly been world beaters in their own right. They were the beneficiaries of multiple non-offensive scores in their win against Central Michigan. What do you see in this matchup for 2 programs you know all too well?
Yeah, we're going to go with Bowling Green here, plus the 4.5. So I'm going to keep it very simple. And sometimes with these non-Powers 5 teams, you don't have to break down the EPA, the pass rush success, and all that. Sometimes the market just doesn't have a good handle on these teams, and I think that's the case here. Basic counting stats. We got Bowling Green, nearly a full yard better in yards per play margin. More than 50 yards per game, better in yards per game margin. And you take a look at that. Well, that might not mean much. Maybe Buffalo's, the stats aren't as good because Buffalo played a tougher schedule. No, opposite. Bowling Green's played the much tougher schedule here, and yet statistically in the basic counting stats, they're the superior team. I think a couple of things here that's making some value here on Bowling Green. Buffalo's had a bunch of phony finals so far this year. I know because I've been involved in a few of them. They're down 21 with 5 minutes left, only lose by 7 against Louisiana. I had Louisiana in that game. That was tough pill to swallow. Last week against Central Michigan, a game that, wow, final scoreboard looks great, but, man, you dive into it, in a game that they win by 24, they get outgained. They're +4 in turnovers, Buffalo. They have not one but 2 pick sixes against Central Michigan, so that one a little bit of a phony final. You mentioned it. If we're going to have, if there's a hang up in the handicap, it's been BG as far as high variance team. They've been Jekyll and Hyde all year. Good against Michigan, bad against Ohio, good against Georgia Tech, bad against Miami, Ohio. But, all 4 of those are pretty decent teams. In fact, much better than this Buffalo team that they're going to face this week. And this is, you just go through BG's schedule. This is the second worst opponent BG's going to play, to date. And their worst opponent, they easily handled a pretty solid FCS team. So I think if we get good BG here, you can forget the 4.5. I think they win the game outright. If we get a B effort out of BG, I still think we cover the spread here. So as long as we're not getting the performance they had last week, which I can chalk up to, that was one of their biggest wins in school history. You go on the road as a 3-touchdown underdog. You win going away down there in Atlanta. So I think they're more locked in this week against what I perceive to be an overrated Buffalo team. So let's take BG +4.5.
Brad, I think the reason that you decided to settle on this game is just so Payne's all-time favorite Group of 5 or Power 5 quarterback, who's now in his 57th stop as a starter, gets his lone mention this year in Connor Bazelak. Because if you listen to some of the old breakdowns, when Payne questioned Bazelak's arm strength as a starting quarterback as Missouri, that goes down in the BTB annals of history as some of the more in-depth breakdowns of a quarterback that he never thought was capable of playing at an SEC level. Thankfully, he's facing a MAC defense here in Western New York. Go out there, deliver, Connor, throw for 300 yards, prove us all wrong, get us to the window with an outright victory. 2 quarterbacks, though, guys, that are very much in the thick of things as far as some major hardware this season, and the Heisman race will be on full display in Seattle, Washington, where Bo Nix leads in his undefeated Oregon Ducks to take on Michael Penix's undefeated Washington Huskies. And we look at the betting market on this game, Washington, right around a field goal favorite. We'll call it 3, which it pretty much is in 97% of shops. Total on this game, 66.5 on the low end, upwards of 67.5. Marks the first game between Pac-12 teams, both ranked in the top 8 of the AP poll since 2014, when we saw in the Pac-12 championship game a number 3 Oregon team defeat a number 8 Arizona team 51-13. Washington upset number 6 Oregon 37-34 as a 12-point road underdog last year. Michael Penix threw for 408 yards. Bo Nix, a little bit more workmanlike, 279 yards passing, 2 passing touchdowns. But Oregon has truly dominated this Washington team, albeit Washington a much better current form under Kalen DeBoer than what they've been for years. Oregon has won 7 of the last 8 games in Seattle. Oregon 15-3 straight up, and ATS the last 18 meetings with the Huskies. But 2 teams that have high-powered offenses will be on full display, both inside that top 3 in total yards per game. Washington has really developed a home field advantage. We're seeing what Penix can do with a talented trio of receivers. Meanwhile, this Oregon team, a step up in class, arguably, for them as well. And when we look at Washington, if you're trying to identify a potential Achilles heel, this is a team who's addressed it this week in practice, needs to clean up their penalties. They rank 130th in the country out of 133 teams nationally with 8.8 per game and nearly 95 hidden yards per contest. So, Payne, I'll come to you because there's nothing you love to talk about more on a Wednesday than road Bo Nix. And that's what we're going to see for Oregon matched up against the Washington defense. Will Stein, at least on the surface, hasn't missed a beat calling the offense, taking over for Kenny Dillingham, who took the head coaching job at Arizona State. You look at Oregon's balance, 10th in passing offense, 8th in rushing offense. But Bo Nix stepping up in class against ranked opponents. I know a lot of these losses happened at Auburn. Hasn't exactly always been a guy you can count on, but with a receiver like Troy Franklin, a deep stable of backs where Jordan James is emerging as the true alpha there, and an offensive line that's answered some of the questions early on in the campaign. Who gets the edge here between Oregon's offense against a Washington defense that will no doubt be tested, unlike they have in any game so far this season?
A little bit of a battle going on early in the week, right? At 3 flat, some sharp Oregon money come in. At 2.5, sharp Washington money shows in. So we're back to 3 here, first thing Wednesday morning as we record. And I think what makes this challenging and the reason for the difference of opinion is Washington has warts, right? Despite being undefeated and coming into the season, I think you hit it perfectly. We didn't think the Ducks were exactly perfect, but they really haven't played a soul, and so the potential issue or two is still underlying here. The big wart for Washington comes on this side of the ball, right? I mean, the Huskies are having trouble along the defensive line. That's not a mystery. They haven't been able to stop the run. When you adjust for schedule, Washington is outside the top 100 in defensive line yards allowed, outside the top 100 in havoc created, tackles for loss, outside the top 100 in the country in stuff rate, which is the amount of runs stopped at or behind the line of scrimmage. You look at the Ducks' offense. Some questions with their offensive line. It didn't always look perfect, even against Colorado earlier. They weren't getting a ton of push. That obviously changed. But right now, top 25 in offensive line yards created for the Ducks offensive line, top 15 in rushing success rate, top 10 in EPA per rush. On paper, this side of the trench is all Ducks. I do wonder, there's a little bit of a change in philosophy. You have William Inge and Chuck Morrill, co-DCs, 2 weeks to prepare. Hopefully there's a couple changes here, right? You can't just play with 6 in the box against Oregon because your preferred style of defense is 5 defensive backs. Those safeties have to be extremely active and around the line of scrimmage, especially against Oregon, and I think that's potentially the key. Now, Oregon obviously has 2 weeks to prepare as well, may throw a curveball, decide to push the ball downfield a little bit more. You guys mentioned Bo Nix, but you look at what he's doing right now. To me, Oregon's offense is very much phone booth. And you look at Bo Nix, yes, it looks great this year. The adjusted completion percentage is better than it was a year ago, but the ADOT is dipped, right? You're talking about a full yard lower year over year. We're down to 6.4 yards right now. You look at 155 qualifying quarterbacks, Bo Nix is 149th in the country in average depth of target. If you're Washington, you cannot get beat because you played with 6 in the box and you let Oregon bully you on the ground and dink and dunk their way to 9, 12, 14 play scores while the best part of your team is on the sidelines. And the best part of the team is obviously Kalen DeBoer's offensive mind. It's Michael Penix, and it's those receivers.
Yeah, I mean, look, Washington's one of their best strengths has actually been how they've defended the run early on in the season. We'll see if they're able to do that again in this particular spot, knowing that Oregon will be a little bit more dynamic in that department running the football. Washington, the best rushing team they've played, at least on paper, theoretically, would be Cal. Unfortunately for Cal, they had to abandon the run game early because they were down 14-0 before Washington's offense even got on the field. But when you look at this Huskies offense, Brad, they've been getting out to fast starts. And obviously most teams that they're going to face aren't equipped with the firepower to be able to match what Michael Penix brings to the table. I mean, he leads the FBS in passing yards at nearly 400 yards per contest. He's the only FBS quarterback since 2000 with a 70% completion percentage and 300 passing yards in each of his first 5 games of a season. 17-1 at home as an FBS starting quarterback, going all the way back to his time at Indiana where he was 7-1. I mean, and he's just not getting sacked. He's got time to operate behind this Washington offensive line. And the rich get richer, potentially with the return of Jalen McMillan. All signs point to him being back out there in the fold. When you look at Washington on the offensive side, are you worried that Oregon poses any threats defensively, knowing they're going to get healthier as well with the potential return of Justin Jacobs in their linebacking core, a couple of defensive backs, even if Brandon Dorlus was absent from Tuesday's practice?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the counting stats are going to say that Oregon's going to be by far the best defense that Washington's played so far. But even with that said, still an edge for me is going to be on the Washington side, which I don't see a lot of weaknesses in this Washington offense, starting with play calling. I mean, when you start breaking down this team and watching them on film, you can see why Ryan Grubb was wanted by one Nick Saban in this offseason, interviewed for the job, decided to stay with Kalen DeBoer. You start with Michael Penix, who now is the Heisman favorite. Number 2 in QBR, 400 yards per game, by far number 1 as far as the passing yards go. 75%. The YPA yards per attempt's number 1 in the country. He's throwing to a very good receiving unit, one of the very best in the country, right there with Ohio State and USC. Dunze, Polk, McMillan, if he's healthy, all at least 20 catches, all at least 3 touchdowns. I think they have 3 legit tight ends. If they want to give them some more unique formations, they can go double tight end, and I've seen that, especially in goal line situations. The Westover kid's been a touchdown machine. I think also this year, decent, at least enough balance to throw defenses off pace as far as a change of pace at running back with Dylan Johnson. They're still 60 for as good as their passing offense is and as dynamic as the stats are. They're still only 60-40 as far as the pass run mix. So, with that being said, though, wow, their last game against Arizona, I kind of liked how Arizona defended them. I mean, there was nothing for a Washington team that lives on big plays. Nothing was allowed over the top, really. They were able to get pressure from their defensive line. Washington, who hadn't given up any sacks so far this year, really, one sack in the first 4 games on 153 pass attempts, allowed 2 against Arizona. So that would be the pathway to success, obviously, for Oregon, who does have a couple of good pass rushers. We'll see if the Dorless situation, how that transpires throughout the week. But him and Birch at defensive end, and those are the 2 guys that pop up front for me. And they've been able to get pressure, Oregon, the last 4 games, 18 sacks. They're doing well in the pass game, number 5 in the country. But I got to question the competition as far as the offenses they faced. And the one legit offense they faced, Texas Tech, had a lot of success, 456 yards. And I got to be honest with you, if Tyler Shuck's not turning the football over consistently 4 times in that game, that's probably an Oregon, forget the cover, that's an Oregon outright loss in that game. So I'm wondering what this point spread would be in a situation like that. You always wonder if you change a play or two. And what I'm curious about in this one, is how much Washington will run, because Oregon hasn't been great. You look at their EPA rush, number 56. Will Washington show a little bit of patience in the run game, maybe to keep their defense a little bit fresher? So certainly an edge to Washington here, but a more even matchup than the other side of the ball, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, it's so interesting because you mentioned what Arizona did defensively. It was the first time all year that Michael Penix didn't throw a touchdown. I mean, he'd had 3 in every other game since, and Washington isn't a team that runs at a breakneck pace. They're outside the top 100, at least early on, but they seem committed to getting the Mississippi State transfer going on the ground when opportunity presented itself. And if that's the case, they could put together long time consuming drives and keep Oregon's offense from finding that rhythm. Final word to you, Brad, on this game. When you look at these 2 teams, both have started undefeated. Oregon has exceeded odds makers' expectations every time they've put their pads on so far this year. What have you done? Any adjustments up or down for either of these teams, given the data points we have at hand?
Yeah, significant upgrades for both. Oregon about 4.5 points. Washington, believe it or not, 5 points since the start of the season. So both firmly in the top 10. A really legitimate Pac-12 matchup. Can't wait for this to be a Big Ten matchup conference game starting next year.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned the Big Ten, because one of the next teams we're about to talk about still trying to find out where their home is going to be in 2024 and beyond. And that, of course, is a Saturday night game in Corvallis, where it's UCLA going on the road to take on the Oregon State Beavers. And this number, depending on where you look, a lot of market variance, 3.5 to 4 total. Easy for me to say, ticked up from where this number opened, 54, 54.5, and even some 55.5 that's out there. And these programs will meet as ranked foes for the first time since 2001, when a number 12 UCLA team won at number 19 Oregon State, and it was quarterback Jonathan Smith, now head coach of the Beavers, leading that charge under center in a 38-7 loss. The first time since 2000 that Oregon State heads into a meeting with UCLA as the higher-ranked team. And you look at UCLA, given the imbalanced schedules here, not exactly familiar surroundings. The first trip for the Bruins to Corvallis since 2015, when Josh Rosen was the starting quarterback. When we look at these 2 teams, the Bruins have lost 4 straight, 8 of the last 9 away from home against ranked teams. UCLA overs have been the order of the day when they take on ranked opponents, but this is a Beavers team that has been outstanding at the betting window, going 15-4 ATS since the start of 2022. And Payne, last week, UCLA beat Washington State despite a lackluster performance from their prize recruit at the starting quarterback in Dante Moore. They were able to run the ball effectively behind Carson Steele, who toted the rock 30 times for 140 yards, but it wasn't him that was able to break through. Ultimately, it was Keegan Jones with 3 carries in the game. 2 of those went for touchdowns, including a 22-yard run that gave them a bit of separation. Oregon State defensively, I'm not going to say it's as simple and straightforward as home versus road, but you look at the counting stats, they've been a downright abomination when they go on the road. Gave up 40 last week at Cal, gave up 38 a few weeks ago against Washington State. At home, they've been much more buttoned up, but they dealt with some injuries in the secondary, had a couple of freshmen out there, and, it's never good when a coaching staff says they weren't ready for the quarterback they faced, and it was a freshman curveball of sorts that Cal was able to throw at them. In steps a UCLA team that's going to be a little bit more dynamic offensively, but I think we have plenty of questions about the quarterback position and what Dante Moore can do in his second conference road start.
Yeah, it's always easier playing lesser opponents in your own building than it is going out on the road and playing, I would say tougher offenses. But I think overarching like this is very straightforward for me. Oregon State has to earn the right to force Dante Moore to beat them. And for that to happen, Oregon State has to figure out how to stop the run. The best offenses so far that the Beavers have played, Washington State, they created 2.9 yards per rush before first contact. Last week, with extra time to prepare, Oregon State allowed 3.7 yards before first contact to Cal. Cal was successful on nearly 70% of their runs. And I saw the same quotes you did out of Corvallis, that they didn't prepare for the freshman Mendoza and that they had to allocate more guys in coverage because their top two corners and Jaden Robinson and Ryan Cooper were out. But to get bullied at that rate by Cal is somewhat concerning. UCLA's offensive line, you look at them, they're better as run blockers than pass protectors. Top 30 in the country in offensive line yards created. Carson Steele is serviceable. I like seeing Chip Kelly sprinkle in Keegan Jones, as you mentioned. Probably needs more of that to help this offense out. It kind of feels like DeAnthony Thomas light. And so far, UCLA, top 30 in EPA per rush. So that's kind of the matchup here. If Oregon State can stop the run well enough, Corvallis is probably going to be a house of horrors for Dante Moore. It has been for a lot of young quarterbacks. I don't want to sound off alarm bells because Dante Moore probably has a very high ceiling in the future. I don't know if he's the best quarterback right now, and there was some whispers that he might leave if he were not to get playing time. And so I think that's kind of forced UCLA's hands a little bit. And you look at the tougher defenses Dante Moore's faced, just has not been good. Utah is better defensively than Oregon State, but you look at Washington State and Oregon State, while they have different strengths defensively, they're roughly in the same ballpark in terms of defensive quality. So those matchups have not been good for Dante Moore. You look even last week at home against Wazoo. It was a struggle. If you look at some of the stable metrics, which is throwing from a clean pocket, that's a stable metric for a quarterback. 48% completion rate from that clean pocket for Dante Moore. When being assisted by play action, which is supposed to enhance a quarterback's ability, 62 passer rating. All signs point to Oregon State getting both its starting corners back. Robinson and Cooper warmed up last week prior to the Cal game and then didn't go. I think they're full go this week. You look at Oregon State, they've shown an ability to create some havoc up front and get pressure on the quarterback when they're at home, whether it was Nate Johnson or Bryson Barnes. Beavers got to Utah's quarterback on 50% of dropbacks. It was 40% against San Diego State, but for me, this is very basic. It's all about Oregon State getting UCLA in a down and distance that forces Dante Moore to be a factor. UCLA right now outside the top 70 in schedule-adjusted passing success rate. They're outside the top 75 in late down success. So if you can be competent enough on early downs and you get Dante Moore in those 3rd and 5 situations, 3rd and 6, 3rd and 7 plus, Oregon State's going to fare.
I mean, Moore was the reason that Washington State was able to hang around last week. He throws a pick 6 before the half. It ends up flipping the script, and UCLA's defense, however, was not going to be denied en route to that 25-17 win that put the Bruins in a spot to go up to Corvallis and potentially pull off, arguably their biggest win of the season so far. But Brad, Oregon State offensively has been a little bit of hit or miss. I mean, a ton of 4th down variance last week against Cal that we know is not going to keep up at this rate. They go 5 for 5 on that particular down. They do extremely well on 3rd down as well, and it's obviously what aided them in putting up 50-plus points against a Justin Wilcox-led defense. But Jonathan Smith didn't back away from calling UCLA's stop unit dominant so far, given what they've seen in terms of their ability to stop the run, create havoc up front with their defensive front. And I guess when we look at UCLA, we have questions about the defensive backfield. It doesn't matter if your defensive line is controlling trench warfare, so to speak. Meanwhile, DJU put together one of his best performance, if not his best, for Oregon State. When you look at the 5 touchdown passes he threw, breaking out of a 3-game slump that had him clocking 3 touchdowns and 4 interceptions during that span. We know the Beavers want to run the ball behind Damian Martinez. He became the 22nd player in Oregon State history to reach 1,500 rushing yards, and he's averaging a program record north of 6 yards a carry. But clearly, if the Beavers are going to have success in this spot, They have to throw on early downs, and you at least got glimpses of what Anthony Gould and Silas Bolden could do against Cal. Will they be able to carry some of that momentum over against this tenacious UCLA front?
You know what? I think so. As good as the counting stats are for UCLA, I mean, number 1 in the country in yards per play allowed, I give the slight edge here to Oregon State. But let me talk, though, UCLA first. Obviously, you know, Payne mentioned it last week. Why was there a disagreement in the marketplace on that Washington State game? A lot of it had to do with, you know, your expectation is how improved this UCLA defense is. Is it weak competition, or is this legitimately a good defense? And at least we got a decent answer last week. I mean, they were pretty dominant against Washington State, only allowed 216 yards and only 10 points. I mean, obviously one of the touchdowns was a long pick six. However, I still have some concerns, because if you look at the success that UCLA's had, obviously questionable non-conference schedule to say the least, and then the two teams in conference play, I mean, a Utah offense, run, no pass with their quarterback situation. And then last week, a Washington State team that's, you know, pass heavy, that really didn't have success running the game, but really didn't come into the game with much run success. So I think this is the first legit, you know, balanced run pass team UCLA will face this year. I mean, obviously the counting stats are going to be great. Pass rush is really good. I mean, led by Latu, who I think, you know, right there with Dallas Turner, one of the best edge defenders in college football last 2 years, not just this year. Rush D's been good, but I mean, we're talking about a UCLA rush defense, number 1 in EPA rush, but finally facing a top 10 EPA rush team in Oregon State. So I think we'll see just how improved this UCLA defense is. I have some doubts, and as long as I'm getting DJ from last week, I'm pretty confident in Oregon State, but we'll see. You know, you never know with DJ. But I got to tell you, I went into last week's game pretty blind. I didn't have a bet on last week's game. I just turned on the highlights. I was like, wow, I think that might be his DJ's best game of his career. And I go look at the QBR. I look at how PFF graded him, and it was arguably, even going back to Clemson, the best game of his career. You like the balance. Martinez and Fenwick can get downhill. You mentioned Silas Bolden, explosive player. That can give you explosives not only in the return game on special teams. They had that fateful 4th down run with him against Utah that blew the game open. And then obviously in the receiving game, Gould's pretty reliable in the pass game. Needs to get more touches, especially like you mentioned, Todd, on early downs. I like their tight end, Jack Felling. He had a career game last week. But, you know, as good as the offensive line is and as much as they get credit, they weren't dominant against Utah, to say the least. I think they're going to have to show a little bit more this week. I give the edge to Oregon State's offense here, even though defensive stats for UCLA are dominant. I still question to this point the offenses that UCLA has faced.
Yeah, look, I mean, the Bruins went out there and answered some of the questions. Doing it at home in your friendly surroundings of the Rose Bowl, a little bit different than what should be an electric atmosphere in Corvallis, a spot where Oregon State has lined people's wallets to the tune of a very good ATS clip. Jonathan Smith, in one of the smaller venues in conference play, has at least made it loud. The fans have rallied behind this team, and if Oregon State's going to do any damage in the Pac-12, these are the kind of games that they have to win. Interesting when you look at the number here, hovering very similar point spread range to what we saw Oregon State laying against the Utah team that probably didn't have nearly the same level of weaponry on the offensive side with Nate Johnson under center. So should be a fun game Saturday night. But when we talk about a Pac-12 team in a game Saturday night, have to imagine, given the posh and pageantry around this historic rivalry, that most eyes in the college football world, at least from casual fans, will be trained on South Bend, Indiana, where the Notre Dame Fighting Irish will welcome in the USC Trojans. And Notre Dame right now pretty much blanketed a field goal favorite. We saw some money come in on the home team earlier this morning on Wednesday. Total on this game, 61.5, 62, 62.5, 63. Pick your poison depending on what side of the ledger you decide to fall on there. The winner of this matchup gets long possession of the jeweled. And Brad, I want to pronounce this the right way. Shillelagh, is that how it's pronounced?
Shillelagh.
Right, had to make sure we get that right and show proper respect to this rivalry. USC ended a 4-game losing streak in the rivalry with a 38-27 win over Notre Dame last year. The Trojans have won 5 of the last 6 games versus Notre Dame when both teams are ranked in the AP poll, including last year's win. Meanwhile, the Irish have lost 8 straight versus AP top 10 USC teams, going all the way back to 1995, When we look at the Trojans, betting them blindly over the total, not something we encourage, has, however, been profitable over the last 14 games, going 13-1 with the average total points scored in those contests north of 79 points. However, Marcus Freeman has gotten the best out of the Irish when they step up in class. 6-2-1 ATS versus ranked opponents last week against Louisville, notwithstanding. Brad, USC offensively, we knew that this was going to be the strength of this team coming into the year. They lead the FBS with nearly 52 points per game, 7 straight contests with 40-plus, tying the most consecutive games in school history. We look at what they've done offensively, 521 total yards per game, 4th in the FBS, 8.4 yards per play, and they've had ruthless red zone touchdown efficiency so far. But you watch SC last week against Arizona, and it almost feels like they're going through the motions, especially early in the game. They weren't overly dynamic or impressive to the naked eye against Arizona State. Is it reason to be concerned about what we've seen from USC, or do we flat out think it's boredom, knowing that the Trojans came into this year with 6 glorified exhibition games before this was their season opener going on the road to take on Notre Dame?
You know what? A little bit of both. I think there is a little bit of boredom, but I mean, you can't be so lackadaisical where it might cost you wins, especially the last couple of weeks. Those games coming down to you got to recover an onside kick to hold on against Colorado, and then legitimately had a great chance to lose against Arizona last week. So not only a little bit of boredom, but I mean, when you look at some of the metrics, particularly up front, against 3 below average Pac-12 teams, I mean, they're giving up some sacks, 8 the last three games, and they're going to face a pretty good Notre Dame defensive line. Maybe not great at the pass rush, but guys that get after you on a play-in and play-out basis. If you're an offensive lineman for USC and you're taking a play off, it's going to be noticeable because guys like Riley Mills, Howard Cross, and Baptiste on the edge will make their presence known. With that being said, obviously, still Caleb Williams playing like a deserving Heisman favorite here, coming off the Heisman Trophy win last year. 22-1 ratio, yards per attempt are there, running the ball a little bit more, especially in the red zone. That's why they've been so efficient, 6 rushing touchdowns. But there's some carelessness, to say the least. There was last year. There's even more so this year, I think. You guys mentioned before we came on and flipped on the record button on the podcast, sloppiness. There certainly is, even from Caleb Williams. I do like the running back position. Marshawn Lloyd's been a great transfer addition from South Carolina. Balanced receiver room, to say the least. A multitude of weapons. In fact, I'd take every one of USC's top 6 receivers are better than any of Notre Dame's top receivers. So it's just a significant weaponry. It'll be interesting to see if Zachariah Branch, who's missed the last 2 games, I think, looking at practice yesterday, I think he returns this week. He could be huge for the special teams for USC. But, the trend line's not great. I mean, because when Arizona's shutting you down last week, particularly in the first 20 minutes of that game, it certainly should raise some red flags. On the other side of the ball, speaking of red flags, not necessarily schematics like Payne will get into about the Notre Dame offense, but just, overall, how much left in the gas tank for this Notre Dame defense that Notre Dame has been leaning on here the last 3 weeks against these ranked opponents. You look at the basic counting stats, says that Notre Dame's a top 15 defense. Eye test says that as well. You look at the first few games of the season, I know against questionable competition, but no team top 4 yards per carry against them the first 4 games. Last 3 weeks, 4.7, 4.7, 4.8. 189 yards rushing allowed to Duke. 185 last week to Louisville. And to me, one of the last offenses, if you're starting to run, if the tank's running on empty, I don't want to be playing USC. It's probably one of the top 2-3 offenses I don't want to face. Pass defense has been good, but again, Notre Dame is going to get by far their strongest test here. I mentioned Howard Cross earlier. He has played like a legit All-American on the defensive line. I mean, when you got a guy like him on the interior defensive line leading the team in tackles, that shows you how much that he's dominated up front, including the Duke game was one of the more dominating defensive line performances I've seen. I am worried, though. You look at the snap counts, especially for their legit high-end starters. They've been super high, the snap counts, the last 3 games. And one thing that their offense hasn't, a multitude of things that Notre Dame offense hasn't done well, but one thing is they haven't given a good recipe for success for the Notre Dame defense. Number 115 in field position. I mean, you look at last week, I was expecting it to be bad. Payne didn't believe me, but I didn't watch last week's game. He's like, oh, no way, you're not watching the game. I'm like, no, I'm not watching the game. I'm not a Notre Dame fan anymore. Didn't you hear the announcement? I'm not watching the game. But rewatching it, I was expecting to see, this is going to be bad for Notre Dame's defense. It honestly wasn't. I was actually okay with it because you look at where Louisville started on their drives. Their own 47, midfield, the Notre Dame 35, the Notre Dame 10, the Notre Dame 26. And for Notre Dame's defense to only give up a total of 3 field goals on those 5 drives said that this unit, is still playing at a pretty high level. This is in the weeds. I have not heard this from anybody in the national media, but something to keep an eye on because I've been talking about Notre Dame running out of gas. Keep in mind, Notre Dame's strength and conditioning coordinator resigned in the summer. So when you're playing 8 straight weeks, starting off the season on another continent, playing a 4th straight game against a ranked opponent, is something like that maybe getting overlooked a little bit? No strength and conditioning coordinator, the guy that took over. His previous experience is the MAC level. Raise some questions for me. I like USC's offense
Brad,
here.
what do you do when Notre Dame plays a schedule like they've played, where it's 8 straight games? You look at the gauntlet over the last couple weeks in terms of trying to quantify that particular impact and building it into your numbers as you handicap a game of this magnitude.
It's a good question. Probably a little bit more significant in their downgrade last week, just because it started to show. It honestly started to show in the Duke game, I thought, in the second half of that one. I thought they were fine in the first half, but started to show. And then there was some explosives last week. So, typically maybe my power ratings would have said, downgrade Notre Dame 1.5, 2 points last week from that performance. I got a little more aggressive and downgraded them 2.5 points.
That's it's always interesting because obviously you try and figure out some of those hidden edges and schedule congestion, so to speak, like the Irish is going through. Showed last week against Louisville. You wonder if they're able to gut it out for 60 minutes against USC before they'll get a much-needed bye after this game. Mother Nature, of course, could also play a role in this particular contest. Going to want to keep tabs on the forecast, as you will for all games throughout the Midwest. We've seen a lot of these totals, especially in Big Ten country, and the MAC starting to take a little bit of money. Make sure you're checking the time of day, the winds.
A little bit of money.
Okay, as I look at it now, a lot more money. Albeit some of those MAC totals open significantly higher than they should have. The most notable one standing out to me, hopefully you got a part of in NIU in Ohio, about 10 points higher than the market, down nearly 2 touchdowns at this point. On the other side of the ball, Payne, Notre Dame's offense matched up against USC's defense. Clearly the Trojans' defense was supposed to be improved. It couldn't get worse from what we saw last year, and I'm not quite sure that's been the case. When you look at USC's energy levels and effort, USC's missed tackles have looked like this game by game. As the competition has gotten ratcheted up, there's more and more missed tackles, 6, 10, 12, 15, 17, and 17. And while the the Trojans excel at getting after the quarterback, at least they're supposed to on paper in known passing situations, Notre Dame is going to lean on the ground game quite heavily in this spot. But Sam Hartman, to Brad's point, doesn't have those same weapons around him in South Bend that he had in Wake Forest last year, and it may be showing up a little bit in some of their ability to check out of various plays, whether or not Marcus Freeman actually allows that in short yardage spots. But when you look at Notre Dame offensively matched up against USC's defense, what are some of the big things that you're looking for on Saturday?
What I quickly realized here is I was nice giving Brad the fun side of the ball to talk about because Notre Dame's offense and USC's defense starting to have more issues than imagined. Both are struggling right now. Neither are in good form. So there's some variance on this side of the ball. And you're coming off a performance where I think Brad hit it perfectly. The reason why its defense was put in such bad situations is because what the offense was doing. Yep. Notre Dame's offense, bottom 10 performance in the last 10 seasons. 25% of Notre Dame's offensive snaps against Louisville resulted in a negative play. And I think you guys hit it perfectly. You start to wonder what's left in the tank. 8 games in 8 weeks, this being the 4th consecutive high-leverage game. And now, Brad, correct me if I'm wrong, midterms this week for Irish players?
Midterms this week. And unlike most schools, Notre Dame kids are going to class.
Right. So there's that mental fatigue of it as well. I wish Notre Dame's offensive line was in better form. It's not ideal what Marcus Freeman and Gerard Parker are doing with all of the moving parts. Notre Dame has to find the right 5 up front like yesterday and keep that cohesion going throughout the rest of the week and leading up to Saturday night. And I get it. It hasn't looked perfect. You look, Duke pressured Sam Hartman on 54% of his dropbacks 2 weeks ago, so there was some panic. But to me, the data provided a little context. Sam Hartman held on to the ball longer against Duke than any other opponent. So it just so happened to be the week that Notre Dame was decimated at receiver. It just felt like Sam was holding on to it a little bit longer, allowing guys to maybe peel open a little bit more. But Notre Dame's offensive line in that game did a fantastic job creating 2.2 yards per rush before first contact against Duke. So you kind of see that panic set in leading into the Louisville game, and it just becomes like a hockey game where, you know, they're in this hostile environment, but they're doing nothing but line shifts. 8 guys played up front. Some guys played multiple positions, and suddenly Notre Dame can't get any push up front. 0.6 yards before first contact created against Louisville. I think Notre Dame has to be able to consistently run on USC's defensive front. Couldn't do it last season.
No,
Generated less. No, it was like 0.8 yards before first contact last season. Had a negative rushing EPA in the first half. Very fortunate Drew Pine had the best game of his college career, or that would have been a little bit more ugly. You look at USC. They're outside the top 80 in schedule-adjusted success rate allowed on the ground, outside the top 100 in EPA per rush allowed. Get your best 5 up front and let Estime and Love go. I look at some of the offensive lines USC has faced post-bye. Arizona, the best of the bunch, but it's Colorado, it's Arizona State, just abject disasters. Somehow USC only generated a 31% pressure rate the last 3 games combined. And I think that's something to think about here, because you look at the first 3 weeks of the season, Sam Hartman was pressured on 22% of his dropbacks. Last 3 weeks, 43% of the time. And obviously the competition got tougher. Ohio State's defensive front is great. Mike Elko and Duke have a veteran defensive line, but that pressure has really caused Notre Dame's downfield passing game to basically become non-existent. And I think if you can protect up front a little bit better and a little bit more of a game in your class, so to speak, you're going to see the pass game open up a little bit more as well. If Notre Dame can get the ground game going on early downs, which is another area where USC is outside the top 80 defensively, I think that can help unlock Notre Dame's passing game in the intermediate to deep areas. I think there's a clear path for success for Notre Dame's offense, but if the O-line isn't in form and the offense as a whole seems to be lacking in confidence and you don't know how much is left in the tank, those are kind of the 3 question marks you have here. Those are the obstacles. I would be calling for a ton of Notre Dame output here offensively, that or relative to expectation, right? Let me kind of downtrend that a little bit. I think you could have a performance above expectation here against this USC defense if some of those question marks weren't there. The total coming down is interesting because there's been a ton of weather reported in the forecast. And if you could project weather perfectly 7 days out, you'd become the richest human on planet Earth. As I look right now, it looks like the wet stuff subsides around 4 p.m. Now, the system could come in and sit longer. Who knows? But right now, it doesn't look as terrible as we initially expected like a day or two ago. But it's a game that you're going to have to monitor that leading up to kickoff. You're going to have to monitor it every single day. But I think if this were to be a sloppy game, maybe it helps Notre Dame a little bit more if it were wet. I don't know Brad's opinion on that.
I totally agree. I mean, you're talking temperatures, low 50s, upper 40s, a little bit wet. That's Notre Dame weather.
Yeah, that's kind of the vibe I get. But they're going to have to be able to run the ball this year. And, Love Estime. Love just shows some burst.
He's got to get more touches.
Yeah, he does, doesn't he? That's kind of what I'm seeing. Yeah. But I think Notre Dame's got paths here if they're not absolutely dead after just playing, 8 games in 8 weeks and 4 straight wars and the travel, outside the country and, midterms and things of that nature.
Brad, have you gotten a turf report? Do we know if the grass is going to be 6 feet high to try and slow down some of that USC speed like Notre Dame has been known to do in the past for games like this?
Won't be an issue. If you're a USC backer, Notre Dame's had turf for 10 years now.
Yes. I know. This is a perfect spot to bring out natural grass, though. Bring it.
Yeah.
Todd thought it was like 1993 against when they would just grow the thing out. When did they go to that? I kind of remember the the tush push or the bush.
That
push,
was
whatever they're
05.
calling it.
05.
That was that. Okay, so that's when the grass was
Best way
was
to
hot.
do best way to do things. Slow down the
Yeah.
other team's speed. Just grow that grass and make them go become Clydesdales out there and plotters instead of the thoroughbreds they want to be running in space. You can follow Brad on X at BradPower7. You can follow Payne there as well at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. Follow me on the platform. Most importantly, as always, for all things Bet the Board, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. More great breakdowns, obviously, as the three of us try and attack the big board. But Payne, sometimes the marquee matchups on any given slate don't offer us the best way to make money at the betting window. So when we're looking to identify a best betting opportunity this weekend, where do you see a little bit of wiggle room and some window to make a few bucks?
I'm told you're not supposed to say the word obviously in podcasting. It comes off condescending to the listener.
I'm going to write that down then. So I won't use the word obviously going back and forth. I mean, don't get me wrong. I shouldn't say obviously because there's a good chance I will have a bet or two in one of the marquee matchups. So I shouldn't say obviously the best bet opportunity. So you're right. I take that back, and I want those last 47 seconds of my life erased from the logs of history.
We've gone back and forth. We've deliberated. We've watched far too many local beat reporter pressers over the last 24 hours to gauge vibe. Let's start the day off with a winner, 12 o'clock, noon Eastern, rotation number 143. Let's go with Michigan State plus the 5.5. This is really intriguing to me because perceptually, Michigan State's a mess, right? Dealing with the whole Mel Tucker situation. But I go through these games and start the season 2-0. You get your shit kicked in by Washington. To me, that's not a big deal. You look at the last two data points. Michigan State outgains Maryland. The same Maryland that just went toe-to-toe with Ohio State in the shoe for three quarters. Sparty goes to Kinnick Stadium, which is like a house of horrors. I understand Iowa's not great, but very tough place to play. And Sparty outgains Iowa by 125-plus yards. They got the ground game going. Even when Iowa isn't very good, they're typically not getting manhandled in the trench on the defensive side of the ball. Michigan State averaged over 3 yards per rush before first contact against Iowa. To me, that's wildly impressive. Nathan Carter has been extremely efficient. The understanding is Jalen Berger is back this week as well, so you have that nice 1-2 punch. I look at a team in Michigan State's class, Virginia Tech. They were able to run on Rutgers, average nearly 2 yards per rush before first contact. The reports that you and I have kind of combed the internet for, watched videos, the information that we've kind of tried obtaining internally over there is the bye week's actually been good for Michigan State. D'Antonio's been a calming effect, really helped reorganize the secondary. Sparty, the one thing they've been able to do defensively this season is stop the run extremely well. Sparty's also not divulging who their starting quarterback's going to be. They're making Rutgers prepare for all three. So, like Michigan State here, plus the 5.5. Total's low. Make this a little bit of a grinder. It feels like they have the edge on both sides in the ground game. If Michigan State doesn't turn it over here, Todd, I think they got a shot to spoil Rutgers' homecoming.
Hey, look, there's nothing better than going into somebody else's house and spoiling the afternoon in Piscataway, New Jersey, early on Saturday. Weather forecast-wise, do we expect some wet stuff, the good old precipitation as the great equalizer?
I don't know if we would need the great equalizer, but it does appear a little wet, which again, probably puts a little bit more emphasis on both teams' ground games, of which
I think Michigan State gets the edge.
Yeah, on both sides. So let's take the points there and a little
Spartacus grinder. It is. Sometimes it's not a beauty pageant to get a winner to the window. Michigan State plus the points against Rutgers. All right, my friend, another day of business is complete on the college football front. We get to reconvene, talk a little National Football League same time tomorrow. Any final words of wisdom, parting shots, a little bit of wisdom you may or may not like to share with our listenership?
Back tomorrow, the NFL. That has certainly gotten the best of us to start this young season. I'm hearing Not totally surprising. Book's not the best start to the NFL
It is
season.
not how you start, my friend. It is how you finish, and we have to build back one W at a time, and it'll start this week in the NFL. I am confident in that. You can follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there. As always, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod with a Michigan State ticket in hand Saturday. Early morning out here on the West Coast, afternoon on the East Coast. We'll see you at the window.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Bet the Board. Make sure you follow Todd and Payne on X. Todd is at Todd Fuhrman. That's TODDFUHRMAN. And Payne is at Payne Insider. That's PAYNEINSIDER. Don't forget, our weekly newsletter comes with an additional best bet. Have that delivered to your inbox by clicking the link atop the podcast show notes. And most importantly, subscribe and download Bet the Board. We're on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Wondery, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and all your other major platforms.